Hello and welcome to Comics Over Time. This season, which we're calling Murdock and Marvel, a history of Marvel Comics starring Daredevil, is our most ambitious project yet. Our plan is to look at the state of the comic book industry during a particular year, and then to examine in detail the major ways that Marvel Comics in particular evolved during that year. We'll look at who was creating comics, what new characters or storylines were introduced, and which comics either debuted or ended. After that, we'll get down to business, take out our stack of Daredevil comics, and look at what our old friend, the Man Without Fear, was up to during that same time. We're glad you've joined us. My name is Dwayne. With me, as always, my good buddy Dan. Dan, how are you doing tonight?
Doing great. Been a good week. How about yourself?
Doing well. It was interesting having last 1986 split across 2 weeks because we ended up talking so much. I'm hoping we're not going to have to do that again tonight.
We are probably not going to have another 1986 tonight. Let's just put it that way.
Okay. Thank goodness for that.
That's good and bad because it means we don't have four of the greatest comic stories of all time to obsess over either.
That is true. That is true.
There you go.
So what are we going to be talking about tonight, Dan?
My good man, 1987 is a year where we start to see the black and white bubble begin to bust a little bit. We start to see Marvel make some big changes in terms of its personnel, both in terms of the folks we don't see anymore and some of the new names coming in that are going to be making a difference in the next few years. DC and some of the other companies are also very busy. DC has an explosion of new stuff that we'll talk about this year. It's actually a very exciting year to be a DC fan. There's a few other new books that come out that are pretty important, and there's a lot of things going on in the greater environment that we want to talk about. So I would say this is a very impactful year, not nearly as much fun as 1986.
Yes, I just looking at our notes and knowing what I know about the books that we read specifically for Daredevil, it was definitely not to 1986's level in 1987.
The rest of the industry did not experience the cliff this year that Daredevil did. It just had a beginning decline. Although the narrator in my head is saying, the cliff is straight ahead. So wait for that. We're going to get there.
Well, I want to thank everyone for putting up with 1986 across 2 episodes. We really appreciate that. We did it as much for you as it was for us. I did get a comment on X from Forrest, who said he is excited about hearing my thoughts about Watchmen when I finally get a chance to read that series, which I definitely am excited about trying to get to at some point. I have to get actually access to the comics because I don't know if I have access to them currently.
So 2 or 3 options. I mean, obviously, I can borrow them to you, bring them down at spring trading next year. But if you wanted to get it easier than that, it's at every bookstore still, because it's been in print constantly for 30 years. It's at every comic shop and pretty much every library. So you could also grab out your library card or like a Hoopla or something like that and get it that way. And in fact, I would say that if you don't have one already and you haven't used it for some of these classic books, getting a library card from your local library and getting the Hoopla digital access is probably the best way to read stuff like that. Because any of these really big books, a Mouse or a Watchmen, is going to be available through pretty much every library system digitally.
My wife has actually set up and done that so that she can do some reading as well. She reads novels and things like that, so not the same sort of stuff that I would be reading, but she could definitely, I think, help me out with that. So good call there.
Yeah, and once it's set up, it's exactly like reading Marvel Unlimited, because you just download the Hoopla app, you take the book out, and then it appears in your available options to read at that point. So,
All right. I think that's all the kind of introduction that we have. So why don't we jump in and let's talk 1987. The year in comics. All right, Dan, it is 1987. We've seen the big explosion in 1986. Where do we start when we're talking about comics as a whole for 1987? You mentioned DC's got a lot of stuff going on. You mentioned the bubble bursting a bit on the black and white stuff. Where do you want to begin?
So we normally begin with DC, and I think this is as good a place as any again this year. It was a banner year for DC in a lot of ways. There's a lot of stuff that folks from my generation remember very fondly, and especially I think folks even a little younger than me remember very fondly. So Batman Year One came out in issues 404 to 407 of Batman. That, of course, is one of the big stories of the year. That's Frank Miller moving over to DC, and after doing the Ronin series and stuff, he then also did a 4-issue run where he takes a look at sort of a reimagining of Batman's first year in the Cape and Cowl. It's a really good story, been extremely influential, and is another one of those that's been in print forever. It really does, in many ways, stand with Dark Knight and Born Again as one of Frank Miller's sort of masterpieces.
Very nice.
We do then later on that year, they bring out Year 2 in Detective, 575 to 578. It does have early Todd McFarlane art. It's actually pretty decent, but it is in no way Year 1. So, but they did do both of those that year. There was a graphic novel by Mike Barr and Jerry Bingham, actually called Batman, Son of the Demon, that was a story that talked about how Bruce Wayne and Talia, Ra's al Ghul's daughter, end up actually kind of falling in love, and at a certain point she gets pregnant, and then when it comes time for the baby to be born, she tells Batman that it has died, but in actual fact it gets sort of just moved off into a monastery or something like this. So Batman doesn't know that he's got a kid, but at the end we know that there is actually a child of Bruce Wayne out there somewhere. This comes around again later, many years out, when Damian Wayne shows up. So it's been, in retrospect, a very important part of DC history, at least of the last 5 or 10 years of DC history. Wonder Woman #1 came out by George Perez. It's a reboot of the Amazon Princess and her world. It is among well over a dozen new ongoing series that DC spun out at the end of Crisis. We also have a new Superman #1, a new Justice League #1, Flash #1, Doom Patrol #1, Shazam #1, and then some other books as well. So
wow, that's like all their heavy hitters. It seemed like got rebooted and started back up again.
Yep, because last year we also had the reboot of Action Comics, and the one that hasn't been rebooted is Batman, which at this point continues on with its original numbering. So almost all of the other books, but they did keep 2 of them, Batman and Detective, that at this point at least retain their original numbering. We had some stuff from other publishers. Usagi Yojimbo #1 by Stan Sakai comes out. His Samurai Rabbit came out about 2 years earlier in an anthology book, but this is actually the point at which, after a few guest appearances here and there, Usagi actually gets his own book. This is going to become one of the most important independent books. Sort of along with Cerebus and Love and Rockets and ElfQuest, you can put Usagi Yojimbo in there as well. Stan Sakai, I've mentioned, has won like every lettering award, basically, where he was one of 2 guys who pretty much shared the Eisner Lettering Award for 20 years. But he also is the writer and the artist on this. Just a fantastic comic book.
So forgive my ignorance, but why was this so influential?
I think just because it's such quality. This is another one of those anthropomorphic animal type books. So it's sort of
Right.
like if you did, instead of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, you do middle-aged, non-mutant rabbit samurai. Okay? But
Sure.
but nonetheless, he is so good at it, and the story is told so well and so seriously that even though you've got this sort of like Bugs Bunny looking character, the story itself just takes you away.
Gotcha.
And
Okay.
yeah, I really am hard pressed to explain Usagi Yojimbo, except to say that I bet the library has that too. And
Sure.
you could certainly go give it and again, I've got them as well. But it's well worth the trouble. I would love to at some point get his first appearance, but it is actually one of the most expensive comic books of the modern age. So,
Really? Okay.
yep.
Just probably because it was so limited release and so hard to come by, I would imagine.
You are 100% correct. It was printed initially in a book called Albedo Anthropomorphics in 1984. Extremely limited run book.
Sure.
And especially in high quality, it's just really hard to find. So the thing is worth just thousands of dollars at this point.
Oh, okay.
And it is cool, though, because it's not the sort of thing you would necessarily think was going to be this popular. But what he does is he mixes folklore and he mixes adventure and everything, and it's cool. You really just
Yeah,
you really
I
just
mean,
can't compare it to
sometimes
anything
it is
else.
that simple. Yeah.
I
Yeah,
have
sometimes
a
it
hard
is
time
that simple.
giving you a comp. But in any case, we had that. We also had Concrete #1, which is also extremely difficult to explain. It's basically a guy who looks sort of like a pile of bricks who has adventures, but they're more like low-key adventures. But Paul Chadwick just makes this interesting as well. Concrete is going to win a lot of awards from folks who want something other than superhero stories, as one of their favorite books of the year for a while here. We also got some imports from Japan coming over, some of our earliest manga series being imported. First Comics brought Lone Wolf and Cub over. And not only did they bring it over, but because one of the biggest fans of Lone Wolf and Cub was a guy named Frank Miller, they hired Miller to do original covers for every one of the imported albums, and that made them sell way better. Plus the fact that Miller himself put a stamp of approval on saying, this is sort of what I was hoping to do when I'm doing Ninjas and Daredevil, right? This is the sort of thing that had influenced me. And they were really good. And also a book called My the Psychic Girl, which Eclipse published through, I think, a licensing agreement with Viz or something like that, which many people talk about as being the first manga series to be fully migrated and sort of reprinted in English in America. So we're starting to see sort of that manga influence coming into the market as well, and sort of making a beachhead with some of these books. In terms of other things, one of my favorite things about the late 80s was the fact that Uncle Scrooge made a comeback because of a guy named Don Rosa. And Rosa had been a huge fan of the Barks Ducks and of a lot of the sort of like Walt Disney Comics and Stories stuff from back in the day. Extremely talented illustrator. He actually negotiated with Gladstone, who had the rights to Donald Duck and Uncle Scrooge and all that, to do the original story. And he'd actually done the story before, sort of with different characters, but had always maintained that it had been meant to be an Uncle Scrooge story. He just couldn't let anybody publish him with that, so he changed things. So he changed it back, did this Son of the Sun story, which is fantastic, in Uncle Scrooge number 219, and then from then was invited to continue producing some additional sort of duck stories. You've pretty much got two people in the history of the Disney Ducks in comic books, and that's Carl Barks and then Don Rosa, who even Don Rosa would tell you he's no Carl Barks, but he's still pretty damn he's still pretty damn good.
Okay.
So there are people who prefer Rosa actually to Barks, but they are in the minority. Although almost everybody loves both of them if they're Ducks fans.
Sense.
And some bad news coming from overseas. We did see the end of Metal Hurlant, which was the book that inspired heavy metal and the like over in France. And that had ran for probably about 10 years or something like that, but reached its end in 1987.
Okay. Right. So what about like industry trends as a whole, as we're thinking about all of comics in general before we, dive into more specific things? What were we seeing, or what would be important to note?
No. You continue to see that question of what's appropriate for which readers and what's appropriate in terms of what comic books are going to stock. DC actually started the year trying to decide if it was going to begin putting a sort of appropriate for all audiences or appropriate only for mature audiences tag on all of its comics. Lots of creators, including Frank Miller, who was one of the people they wanted to keep happy at the time, were upset about the idea that there would be this idea that some comics would be labeled as okay and some comics essentially labeled as not okay. They believed that was bringing in censorship. After quite a lot of back and forth, DC did continue to have a for mature readers tag that they would put on some of their books. But for the most part, they scrapped this plan and just decided that all of their books would be out there and they would use things like the price of the book and the format and the like of the book to sort of keep kids away from it. With the idea that if it's priced 3 or 4 times as much as another comic book, the kids will know just because of their wallet that that's not a book that was meant for them. We also saw problems with creators and creator ownership. Thunder Agents, the book that for a long time, Hollywood's Thunder Agents, had been a kind of a lightning rod almost for some of these ownership questions. People had thought it had gone into the public domain, but there was one guy, dude by the name of John Cabanero, who believed that it actually was owned by him. And people kept publishing Thunder Agent books in 1987, and he kept suing them. So you continue to see this. And this, of course, that whole idea of the public domain is going to become even more important with comics and everything else as we move along.
I suppose.
And these properties get to be more and more valuable. So there's a number of cases pending for Thunder Agents in 1987 as well. Other than that, we saw Marvel actually give back nearly 2,000 pages of art, original art, to Jack Kirby. We also saw Neil Adams get his art back from Marvel. The interesting thing here is that after years of Adams and Kirby pressuring them, neither of them signed that sort of toxic work-for-hire agreement that basically said, yeah, we'll give you your art back, but you have to agree that in perpetuity, everything you created for us creatively belongs entirely to us, and you had no say in it. And neither man would sign the contract, and so they never got their art back. And eventually, public outcry just forced them to do it. So yeah, if you think of the fact that 2,000 pages, a lot of his stuff now is going for, say, $10,000. I believe that works out to about $20 million in art that they gave back to Jack Kirby when they gave in on this. Perhaps even worse is the fact that according to Kirby, he had done something like 13,000 pages of art for Marvel, and over the 30 or 40 years he worked for them, they had lost 11,000 of those pages and didn't have them to give back. So because of that, that's what probably $80 or $90 million that got shredded on the floor someplace or went out the back door. So,
that is a drop in the proverbial bucket, as they say.
So kind of nuts. But outside of that, the big news was that the black and white boom, which was causing all sorts of new publishers to come up, and instead of publishing like 5,000 comics or 3,000 like the original first printing of the Turtles, a lot of these were going right to 20,000, 40,000 print runs, and the distributors and the stores were buying them up because they figured they'd be able to sell them because that's what had been happening in 1985 and into the early 1986. Now in 1987, we're seeing reports that a lot of those things are dropping 80 to 90% in terms of what's actually being sold. So a book that would have sold 40,000 in 1986 is selling 4,000 in 1987, right? What this does is it creates a chain reaction. So you still have publishers piling into the clown car. We had 103 new American publishers putting out their first title in 1987. Among those, only one or two actually stuck around. We had Malibu, which actually was a merger of a number of other publishers that were going under, that managed to survive until 1995 and put out like 600 and some titles. We had Heroic, which had 70 some titles before it went out, and then Fleetway/Quality, which had 60 some. All the other ones died relatively quickly after putting out just a few titles. We also, besides those 103 coming in, had 84 breathing their last. Many of them, some of the ones that just started this year. But others included Silverwolf, Amazing, Des Skins Quality Periodicals. A number of these were less than 2 years old, but some of them, like Quality, had been around for a little while. But we had a massive crash again of publishers leaving. And because of the fact we had all these coming in, and people could see that the product was not what it needed to be in terms of what, you know, the distributors were selling to the stores or the stores were trying to market to customers, there was actually an attempt to form something called the IPCA, the Independent Comic Publishers Association, which would have a logo on it that essentially said, "This comic bears the ICPA logo, a symbol of quality in the small press, black and white market. This was formed to promote excellence in and further awareness of this growing segment of the comic book industry." I have never heard of the ICPA.
I was wondering.
Until I was researching this. I think it was an attempt to shore up a market that was already dying or dead by the time that it actually was coming into play. So there evidently are a few comics that do have this logo, but very few of them bother. What really happened is that we saw a number of distributors go under. We saw a number of stores go under. In most cases, the reason for this was that they had leveraged a lot of money into buying books from these black and white publishers, buying lots of books from these black and white publishers. When they did so, they essentially were expecting to be able to turn around and sell them to customers, right? Well, They kept buying them. The stores kept buying from them, racking up debt. And relatively quickly, people started realizing these weren't all Teenage Ninja Turtles. They weren't all worth, 20 times what you pay for them a month later. And they stopped buying them. But as they do that, things just kept piling up in the supply chain, where the stores had paid for all of these books they can't sell. The distributors had paid for all these books that they now can't sell to the stores because the stores are already overstretched trying to get rid of the books that they'd been sold 2-3 months previously. And at a certain point, the whole thing collapsed. And in 87 is really when we start to see this collapse, where a number of stores go out of business, a number of distributors go out of business. Publishers, of course, in many cases are about to go out of business if they haven't already. A number of these that, we talk about 84 of them having their last book in 87. Many of them didn't know their last book was their last book when they published it. But they published it, sent it out, and solicited it to distributors. And the distributors said, "We are not buying this trash anymore because we've already got 3 months of it that we can't sell, and we're about to go out of business anyway, so we have no money to pay you, even if we wanted to buy it." And so at that point, you also have a number of these publishers that are stuck with unsold content, and then they crash as well. So
the domino effect there.
Not a great situation. So obviously, this didn't affect Marvel and DC directly, but it did affect them in that there were a lot of people who were disillusioned by the fact that they had lost money trying to kind of get into the more speculative side of comics. And it was bad for them because losing distributors, losing stores affected the larger publishers just like it affected the smaller ones.
Makes sense.
No. So it was overall a rough year in terms of comics. Probably exemplifying that is the fact that we also lost 3 of the longest running comics in sort of the modern era. Archie Comics in 1987 canceled Pep Comics, which had debuted in 1940 and ran straight until 87. Laugh Comics, which had started in 1946, and Betty and Veronica, which had started in 1950. So Archie ended up losing 3 titles, all of which were at least, 35 to 40 years of, no, more than that, 37 to 47 years of consecutive publishing. No.
All right. Well, so what does that mean as far as like awards go then? What does this year look like with awards going on?
This is just a headache is what this is.
That seems like that would be the case.
Somehow, I mean, not because of all the other crazy black and white stuff, but somehow we ended up with 4 awards given out for 1987.
Wait, what?
There were 4 different major awards, like presentations for 1987 books. You still had your Trusty Eagle Awards from Britain, which was doing their American section. We had the Kirby's, which continued into 1987, but then announced they would be discontinuing. So they gave 1987 awards. And then in response to that, 2 new groups, the Eisners and the Harveys, came in. The Eisners spawned directly after the announcement that the Kirby's would discontinued. These are the ones that are associated with Comic-Con. Essentially, they are the direct heir to the Kirby's, because many of the same people who organized the Kirby Awards then organized the Eisner Awards afterwards. Why exactly there was a change, it's kind of political and this sort of thing, why they changed and redid it. And then there's also another group, the Harvey Awards, that were created also in response to the Kirby's going away, because they didn't know there was going to be the Eisners announced. This is a different group led by Gary Groth of Fantagraphics. It moves around from convention to convention. Originally, it started at the Chicago Comic-Con. Last few years, I think since 2017, they've presented at the New York Comic-Con. And in general, I think especially more recently, the Harvey Awards generally are going to be a bit more avant-garde, and they will be more focused or more likely to give something to a smaller publisher or a more independent creator, whereas the Eisners are sort of the more mainstream version of the awards. But for this year, we had all sorts of them. Luckily, it didn't really matter, because the long and short of it is the Watchmen book came out in 1987, so we didn't have to worry about different things winning. Basically, it swept all of the best book type stuff. A lot of people liked Watchmen. People liked Concrete, Swamp Thing. There was a Gumby book put out with Arthur Adams working on it. Yep,
like actual Gumby?
Actual Gumby.
Okay.
It was pretty fantastic. Nexus and American Flag also were among the winners. A number of really good books out there. They also announced at the Eisners their initial Hall of Fame class, which included 3 people, Carl Barks, Jack Kirby, and Will Eisner, which is a very auspicious start if you're going to start a comic book Hall of Fame. Probably the greatest humor illustrator or creator of all time in comics, the greatest superhero creator, and the guy you've named your entire awards ceremony for, and probably the person who's worked the hardest to try and turn comic books into an art form. So that was those were the 3 that they built off of. Much like the Baseball Hall of Fame, you got some pretty impressive names in that in the initial class as well. They started out well.
All right. Well, before we move and talk about Marvel more specifically, Dan, what was your favorite comic outside of Marvel in 1987?
I really love George Perez's Wonder Woman. So I'm a big fan of mythology and sort of any of these sort of history type stories and everything. And these books dug so deep into Greek and Roman myths. Perez's art is fantastic, as always, but it's really detailed, and he's got all of the armor and everything else. These stories were big, and they were crazy, and it was like War of the Gods type of stuff pretty much all the time. Other books I liked, there was Longbow Hunters, which was a Green Arrow book that came out, kind of a darker, edgier take on Green Arrow that I liked a lot. That was in a perfect bound format, so it was a little more expensive. But by this point, I was old enough I could afford a $3 book if I wanted one, so I got them. And, of course, like everybody else, I loved Batman Year One, because even if it's boring to say so, it is pretty fantastic. So there you go.
Sometimes, the popular thing is the popular thing for a reason, right? It's because everybody likes it.
That's no fun, though. Can't be contrary that way.
The year in Marvel.
Excelsior!
Okay, you teased about some big changes coming in Marvel. I feel like the elephant in the room might be Jim Shooter.
The elephant who's not in the room anymore. Yeah, Jim Shooter. 10 years he was the editor-in-chief, and after the change in ownership, he just never really was able to establish himself with the new owners. They fired him, sort of just unexpectedly. Tom DeFalco found out he was editor-in-chief without ever applying for the job. Just sort of...
There you go.
Somebody came in and said, hey, you're the editor-in-chief now. Next man up. Part of this may have been fallout from the new universe and the fact that it didn't succeed. Part of it's going to come from the fact that he wasn't necessarily seen as somebody who's a company man after complaining about the way some of the chicanery happened during the transfer of ownership. And some of it might literally have just been that the new company wanted to have somebody new steering the ship as they came in to sort of get rid of the old ways. In any case, Shooter was fired, and he had some other opportunities, according to some people. According to himself, he was essentially a pariah in the industry at that point for a while. He did come back. We see a lot more of Jim Shooter. This is not the last of him by any means, but it was an ignominious end for a guy who's been doing a lot of stuff for Marvel over the last decade.
Yeah, he's been kind of at the center of everything for like the last decade. And so it's hard to it's going to be hard for me to wrap my head around the fact that he's not kind of in the middle of everything going forward.
Yep. I do think that one thing, though, that is an important thing to note is that as he leaves, you have almost an entire generation of great artists and writers who refuse to work for Marvel because Jim Shooter has made them so angry they don't ever want to work for him again. And one of the things that we see in 1987 is that DC absolutely wipes the floor with Marvel in terms of established talent, simply because so many people have left the company over Jim Shooter's policies or personality. And some of them have come back occasionally. We've still got one or two guys like Walt Simonson who are around for at least part of the year. But man, it's rough. So I think the other thing that maybe it may have been time, because I think that really he had burned an awful lot of bridges. He'd done some good things. We've had our Shooter meter where he does something that you like and then he does something you don't like, and he's constantly on the up or on the down. But he seems like he may have been the right guy for the job in the early 80s or the late 70s, especially the late 70s. I think he probably was. And he may not be the right guy for the job now.
Well, that makes sense. What else besides Jim Shooter leaving as editor-in-chief was going on at Marvel then at this time?
We'll talk about a bunch of other folks sort of, coming in and that sort of stuff. But in terms of some of the story things that happened, John Walker takes over as the Super Patriot in Cap. He'd been introduced a year or so earlier. We had Craven's Fearful Symmetry storyline, which saw him sort of replace Spider-Man for a little while. That is a storyline a lot of people really enjoyed. We also saw Peter and Mary Jane get married. This was the year that finally, after all those years, Peter popped the question and they got married. That was a big book that lots and lots of copies sold as well. So
I imagine.
So one of the interesting things about this is that when they decided to have the wedding at Shea Stadium in 1987, there actually was essentially a production put on where Spider-Man and Mary Jane kind of walked out to the plate at Shea Stadium, and actually Stan Lee was the officiant. He was the pastor that married them, and
really?
the dress that Mary Jane is wearing was actually created by a fashion designer named Willie Smith, who actually he'd done a number of runway shows and stuff like that. So an actual fashion designer designed the dress. They made that dress that she wore at Shea Stadium, and then that's also the dress that was drawn in the actual issue. So it's kind of interesting that each of these sort of things they tried to turn into a publicity event and the like. But this was kind of a cool one. I think you can find sort of video of it out on the internet if you look. But in any case, it is definitely something weird that happened back in the day. So,
you have a link that I can include in the show notes? Crazy.
Did you doubt me?
No, I did not doubt you in the slightest. I'm just saying this is crazy.
So as a note, dear listeners, we've just showed Dwayne the YouTube clip of Spider-Man getting married. It's in the show notes if you'd care to go out and watch for yourself. And you have to go to the end, but it's got Entertainment Tonight does a little thing where they show some of the wedding. So pretty crazy stuff, but also kind of cool. Back in the day, we had Iceman, Firestar, the Hulk, Captain America hanging out, all sorts of stuff going on. And they're standing on top of a big paper heart or something like this over the plate. So anyway, other than that, Excalibur takes the MU to London. So we actually have a book based in London with a bunch of X-Men based on, essentially it's got Captain Britain and then also a number of the X-Men. Kitty Pryde, Nightcrawler, etc. Are there. The one this year is just a one-shot, but Excalibur will actually get its own book soon that will continue for a long time.
Right.
They kind of go back to the future a little bit and create a book called Solo Avengers, which if you remember the old comics that we used to have in the 60s where there'd be one of the titles, for instance, is half Captain America and it's half Iron Man, right? Well, they're doing it again. They created Solo Avengers, which is essentially a half Spider-Man title. He gets an 11-page story every month. And then another character, one of the other Avengers or somebody that they want to give a little bit of time to, gets the other 11 pages. So instead of being a team-up book, it's two individual stories. And one of them isn't necessarily a backup story. They both get the same amount of pages. They're just sharing the book.
Gotcha. Okay.
And then we saw the start of what's called Stark Wars in the comics. We now know it as Armor Wars. That was sort of cannibalized for use in the MCU in a couple of their stories there. So the Armor Wars storyline starts here and it ends in 1988. Overall, it wasn't a particularly life-shattering year for most things. I think that the Spider-Man wedding was the most interesting thing in the comics as well. That had been something that had been going for a long time, and there were a lot of people who just didn't like the idea of Spider-Man being married. Others thought, it's been 25 years, it's time to grow up. So it was something that continued to have controversy, and this is not the last time we're going to see some controversy around Spider-Man and Mary Jane. So wait for it. There's some crazy stuff coming in about 15 years.
I was going to say. This also does sort of rock the whole illusion of change thing. I mean,
yes,
that is an actual change that you then have to deal with afterwards.
Is it though? I
mean, presumably, yes. Maybe I guess I just don't realize just how inconsequential getting married is.
I've got one word for you: Mephisto. We'll get back to this later. Don't worry about it.
Okay.
So for now, it's all good.
So what about new titles in 1987?
First thing is they launched the Marvel Masterworks hardcover series, which this was essentially one of the first acts of Tom DeFalco. They said, what are you going to do? Because the new universe sucks and we're going to get rid of it. And he's like, how about we do these hardcover reprints of our old classic, like Fantastic Four number 1 through 10, or, X-Men 1 through 10 or whatever. And they did it, and the books sold like crazy, and they didn't have to pay any artists or any writers. And the bean counters upstairs were super happy with their new editor-in-chief. So these were kind of cool, though. They were some of the first hardcover Marvel comics ever. There were maybe a couple of them before in bookstores of sorts, but they just reprinted the comics. Better paper, better colors, that sort of thing. But this was something that really had never been done at this level. We'd seen some reprints, like in comics. But now this is that idea of these being archival sorts of things that you can put on your bookcase and be all fancy about with your old copies of Fantastic Four.
Sure.
So, outside of that, new things released were, as far as the big ones, there were 65 new titles released. 24 of them were at least intended to be new series. The ones that were most successful were the Silver Surfer, Volume 2, which went for 148 issues. Punisher, which went for 104 issues. This came directly out of his miniseries last year. It was so popular, they're like, hey, let's get this guy a series. This will not be the last new Punisher series in a while. There's going to be a time when he's going to have multiple books. But for now, this is the first one. Conan Saga was an oversized book that, again, was a reprint book, reprinting some of the old Barry Windsor Smith and other first Conan books. Solo Avengers, we talked about, came out. That lasted for 20 issues. And then Flintstone Kids, Heathcliff's Funhouse, Bullwinkle and Rocky, Madballs, Foofur, Air Raiders, all debuted this year into the kids market with that Star line. All of them lasted less than a year. So, unfortunate. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, so what about more limited sort of series? That seems to be where a lot of action seems to be going the last couple of years.
There's 25 of them. And Fallen Angels was one. Comet Man, which I was talking to Ken, our friend Ken, today, and he said Comet Man was one of that he really enjoyed, the Comet Man miniseries. So we have a Comet Man fan out there. I don't know how many other folks are in that. Visionaries, G.I. Joe and the Transformers crossover. We had Fantastic Four versus X-Men. We had a Chuck Norris miniseries. X-Men versus Avengers. There were some graphic novels like the Death of Gru graphic novel that I really enjoyed. That Excalibur special edition. Another Marvel graphic novel called The Pit. We had Master of the Universe books. We had House 2, the second story, movie adaptation, a RoboCop movie adaptation, and then a couple other graphic novels like The Big Change and what was the other one? Conan the Reaver. So tons of different things that came out that were either sort of those one-shots, more like a graphic novel, or that were miniseries. A lot of them not in universe, like the Chuck Norris stuff.
I was gonna say Chuck Norris in the Marvel universe. Okay,
that sort of stuff has happened. I don't know that he technically is not in the Marvel universe. I don't know they specified it, but I don't think it was a superhero book, so he doesn't have to be in the Marvel universe. So yeah.
Of course. Okay, so what about new characters? We saw that a lot of new titles doesn't necessarily mean that we're gonna get a bunch of really new and interesting characters. What did 1987 look like from that standpoint?
What if I told you that Ken and I were sort of arguing about whether like Comet Man or Goblin or I don't know, maybe Malice or someone might be the number 5 introduction. All of those are not characters anyone really is probably all that familiar with. We had Bushwhacker introduced in Daredevil 248, and he's going to come back every once in a while.
Yes.
We have Microchip, who's kind of the man in the chair for the Punisher, was introduced in Punisher number 4. Ghost, who ends up being one of the antagonists in the second or third Ant-Man movie. If you remember Ghost.
Second movie, I think.
Second movie, debuted in Iron Man. And then the only one of them that's a real sort of like top shelf name was Mr. Sinister, debuted in X-Men 221, and he's going to go on to be a very, very important part of the X-Men universe. So in consecutive years, we've had Apocalypse and Mr. Sinister, 2 X-Men villains, sort of as the number 1 with a bullet top characters introduced. So, and in many ways, what I think we're seeing is that as more and more people we've talked about are taking their characters out into the indie world, Chris Claremont seems to be the only one, or the Claremont and his mutant team are the only ones who are just like, screw it, we're just introducing characters and writing comic books, and Marvel's going to steal our intellectual property, and we're okay with that. And so away they went.
What about series that ended in 1987? Did we see much come to an end this year?
A lot of churn. So 66 series ended in 1987. A lot of them were some of those limited series that we talked about. But as far as ones that were bigger ones, you had Doctor Strange, Volume 1, ended at 81 issues, or maybe Volume 2. I think it's Volume 2. Marvel Saga ended at 25. Alien Legion made it to 20. Peter Porker, the Spectacular Spider-Ham, ended at 17. And then Top Dog was at 15 issues when it ended. Ewoks at 14. Swords of the Swashbucklers, which was an epic book, ended at 12. And then we had Kickers Incorporated, Mark Hazard, Night Mask, all of which ended at 12 issues, all of which are New Universe books. Cloak and Dagger only made it to 9, which made me sad. And then Spitfire and the Troubleshooters, another one of the New Universe books, got the cut at 9. And Codename Spitfire got the cut after only 4 comics had come out. So of the initial 9 New Universe books, 5 of them got canceled this year. So,
I'm going to say, some of these I recognized as being very recently. We talked about them starting up, and they're already coming to an end.
We barely knew ye. So, it's the way it goes.
All right, so what does the bullpen look like then? Obviously, we have a new editor-in-chief, Tom DeFalco, but what are we talking with regards to creators and that as we steam towards the Rookie of the Year?
So it looks like we're about 325 or so creators. It is a little fuzzy simply because there's a lot of new reprints that came out this year.
Sure.
And separating some of those out, I believe I separated them out and got to 325, but it could be off by a few because it took some additional work to get some of that sorted out. Because my initial queries all kept coming back and saying Stan Lee and Jack Kirby were the 2 most prolific creators in 1987. Yeah. So, in any case, but yeah, it was a year when a lot of the big names were no longer there. So a lot of the people who were big writers, big artists, were guys like Claremont and Grenwald and Larry Hama. As far as penciler, we had Al Milgrom, Warren Kramer, and Howie Post, who I believe were doing kids' books, were the two biggest ones. So a lot of these now, because the kids' books a lot of times had smaller stories, I think that's also swamping some of the numbers, because one artist could do maybe 3 stories in one of those books and get three story credits, whereas somebody writing a regular one would just get 1 story credit. So that a lot of my high ones are names I don't even recognize, which is kind of crazy. So yeah, I mean, it's Byrne is gone, Miller's gone. There are a lot of young guys who are coming up, people who are just starting. We just saw, for instance, McFarland had his first Marvel work just a year or so ago. We're going to see a bunch of new creators this year who are doing their first stuff, but a lot of them are still very young. So the problem is you've got a lot of creators who are just starting, like Art Thibert and Kieran Dwyer, Mark Farmer, Todd McFarland, Fabian Nocenti. All of these guys are coming up and getting ready. We don't really have a lot of these established guys because most of them have now left after getting in some or another fight started by Jim Shooter. So such is the way of it.
So let's talk about Rookie of the Year then. Who are the new people that are on the block that are very notable, I guess, is what I should say, because it looks like there's at least 1 or 2 names on here that are quite notable, but not necessarily for Marvel.
Correct. Yeah, and all the names I just mentioned, except for McFarland, did their first work for Marvel this year. So there's a bunch of those. But then in addition, Eric Larson, who is the guy who followed McFarlane on Spider-Man and has done a lot of stuff for Marvel. He has about 170 credits, 177 or so credits as an artist and writer for Marvel. He obviously left in 92 to become one of the co-founders of Image. He then created his title Savage Dragon, which has been one of the longest running sort of independent comics of the 90s and into the 21st century. Very, very important creator, but didn't actually have that long of a track record at Marvel. Richard Starkings is actually someone who I think we have to note. He has over 3,000 credits on Marvel books.
That is a ton.
That is a ton. He's worked for Marvel over 17 years, also worked for a number of other companies. He's a letterer, and in fact, he's a pioneer in sort of the digital lettering sort of sphere. He created a company called Comicraft, founded that a while ago, and Comicraft is essentially a lettering house, where they would, instead of hiring a letterer, you could hire Comicraft, and then Starkings and his team would figure out somebody to letter for you. Now, obviously, if you want to have a particular person and their style lettering for you, having a lettering house is a little bit, sketchy in terms of that. But there were a lot of people who needed letterers, and they, especially back in the day when he started, lettering was considered to be more of a technology than something that was a real art. I think these days a lot of people would, want to have an actual person doing their lettering who's got a consistent vision of how the lettering should be done and stuff like that. But there still are lettering houses out there. And again, I guess he was sort of one of the first there too, because I believe Comicraft would probably have been the first sort of lettering collective or lettering subcontractor out there.
Sure.
Other than that, Jim Lee, you may have heard of him.
I have heard of him, yeah.
He is co-creator of Gambit. In X-Men 168, he started a run on the book that really sort of took the X-Men to even higher heights than they'd ever been, even in the Byrne years. He helped to sell 8 million copies of a book called X-Men #1, which rebooted the X-Men franchise. What they did there actually is they printed like 5 different covers. And if you wanted to get the whole Jim Lee cover picture, you had to buy all of them, and then they would go together to make this cool panorama. So many people bought all of them as essentially like an investment, or just because they wanted to have them all. And Marvel's like, oh, well, let us take this bad lesson and learn from it. So, but it's still, as far as I know, that is the highest selling comic book ever. Nothing has ever approached the 8.1 million copies that were sold of X-Men #1. So he does have that going for him. He also then left in 1992 to help co-found Image, and currently is the publisher and chief creative officer of DC Comics, and has been for quite a while. So
several years, I know that.
Yeah, if this was just a, hey, your contribution to comics, Jim Lee would probably take the award pretty easily. But we actually have somebody this year who, even though I love Lee and I think he would be a great choice for something like this, we have somebody who actually has built a Marvel career that I think is just impeccable. And the guy's name is Mark Bagley. And what he has done is actually built up a career as sort of this Spider-Man artist extraordinaire. He's done other things too. He helped to co-create the Thunderbolts. He got into Marvel because he was the guy a couple of years ago who won the Marvel tryout book contest.
Yes.
Where you could buy the book and then ink the stuff. This is actually him. And he not only won the contest, but he parlayed it into a job with Marvel. And he parlayed that job with Marvel into a career that has now gone over 20 years working for them. Probably the thing to me that seals it as far as the Rookie of the Year, though, is that not only is this guy one of a lot of people's favorite Spider-Man artists ever, but his 111 consecutive issue run on Ultimate Spider-Man with Brian Michael Bendis, which started originally with a new Peter Parker in the Ultimate Universe, continued through to Miles Morales, and then eventually, did their thing. This 111 issue run that they did is actually the longest Marvel run by an artist-writer team in the history of Marvel, besting Lee and Kirby's run on Fantastic Four.
Wow, that's saying something. Yeah.
And Lee and Kirby's run on Fantastic Four, I think most people would have thought was, something no one would ever touch. So this is one of those unbreakable records they broke. And he's just a fantastic artist who has left a amazing legacy with Marvel. And so I think that he's a clear as far as a Marvel Rookie of the Year. Mark Bagley's our guy.
Yeah. No, that sounds right. And it would take something like that to best somebody like Jim Lee too, by the way. It seems like he is it seems like everybody has stories about Jim Lee and talk about him, whether it be his time at Marvel or definitely since then. All right, Dan, before we start talking about Daredevil, what was your favorite Marvel comic in 1987?
I think in 87, to me, it has to be the Excalibur Special Edition by Claremont and Davis. I really enjoyed that a lot. This is maybe my first introduction to Alan Davis's work. Other than that, it would have been maybe DR and Quinch reprints from the UK. But by the time that he did this Excalibur work, his lines are so clean, his art is so beautiful. It is just a joy to read Alan Davis artwork. I don't think this was a great year at Marvel, so it wasn't like there were a ton of other things competing with it. But
Sure.
Excalibur, not only this one, but then even the next year or so of books coming out of that, is really kind of a fun story. And I think it was something that I was definitely picking up and enjoying every month back around this time.
I think that's a good option. If there's not a ton of options, that still seems like a good option.
I was not into the Spider-Man wedding, so that was not,
that makes sense.
That was not my thing. So hence, I found other things to entertain me.
Sure. All right. With that, should we move on and talk about our hero friend Matt Murdock?
I believe so.
Year in Daredevil.
How about we get to the heart of the matter? It is time for Daredevil in 1987. Perhaps what I suspect you're going to tell us, the best year of Daredevil in the history of Daredevil. Is that...
No. So let me just preface this by saying it's not bad. It's just not where he's been the last few years.
Isn't it bad?
Well, all right. Well, suffice to say, Daredevil continues on in his own book like he has been for a while now. 238 to 249 are the issues that we're looking at. He also has a dozen or so appearances outside of his main book. Things from The Amazing Spider-Man to the Marvel Saga of Official History, Classic X-Men, Marvel Fanfare, Spectacular Spider-Man, Amazing Spider-Man Annual 21, and Web of Spider-Man. Can you sense a theme here? He was in a lot of Spider-Man titles as well as his own title. With regards to writing credits, we actually had a pretty consistent run here. Ann Nocenti took over the book this year in issue 238, right at the beginning of the year. And save for one issue, 246, she was the writer across all of these books. So this is someone I remember that she got the Rookie of the Year, if I remember, like a year or two ago. She had a book. She had a book last year.
Long shot
in the year, and then now has kind of taken over the writing credits. As far as pencilers go, we had a lot of people work on Daredevil this year. Sal Bucema, Lewis Williams, Todd McFarland, you mentioned him. 241 was the book he did. Keith Pollard, Chuck Patton, Tom Morgan, Keith Giffen, and Rick Loenardi all had penciling credits throughout this year. And with that came actually a lot of different inkers as well. And mainly Al Williamson had the most credits. He had 3 of them, plus 2 more kind of co-credits with Jeff Isherwood and Danny Belandi. But we did have a few other people as well. And I think what we've come to notice, Dan, when you have a lot of changeover in the creative team, even though writing, there wasn't much change, but just in the artists and inkers, it tends to not be great when it comes to just the overall kind of quality of the work. If I'm generalizing, that just
I think that's an
excellent
shorthand. That usually, if you've got a great run, it normally is a great run because there's someone who has a vision, and that's usually a shared vision with all of the creators, where they've got a plan and they come together and they do it. The idea that somebody would write a story interesting enough that it's going to really resonate with a bunch of people, and then the artists wouldn't be assigned to it in a way that would allow them to do it justice, is generally not, I don't think, likely to happen. That the editors know when they've got something, and they make sure that it gets taken care of. And in this, what really it looks like is, after a bunch of these other things, a lot of these are kind of just one and done standalone stories, which
are definitely,
which is good in terms of, Nocenti is still sort of just getting used to Daredevil and starting to get some of this done, and they wanted to make sure that that they stay on schedule and everything, I suppose. So, whatever. But this is not indicative of how her run goes entirely. There are some really great stories she's going to write, but I didn't like the start of her run. So, I'm going to be contrary this week while you're trying to make lemonade out of lemons. I'm going to just sit there and I'm going to just look at the lemons. So
there you go. And to your point, I think when we were, I think it was a week or two ago before we started recording, I had looked and I had found a list of like the 10 best runs of Daredevil on like the Nerdist or something. And the number one was talking about Ann Nocenti and John Romita Jr., who, spoilers for 1988, that's when he comes in along with Ann Nocenti, and there ends up being some really good books next year that we're going to get to talk about. But I had gotten through basically most of 1987 here, and I'm like, I don't get it, because like this stuff isn't anywhere near. And they had her run with John Romita Jr. ahead of like some of the Frank Miller books that we had read, and some of the other really awesome titles that we've talked about very recently. And I was like, how is this better than that? And it's because I hadn't gotten to the good stuff yet. The good stuff is coming, but yeah, it's it took Ann Nocenti, I think, this year to sort of find her writing style. And when we get to 1988, I think it'll shine through. And then she has a dedicated penciler and inker that goes with that, that ends up working out really well. But in the meantime, we get this, which is a bunch of these basically interchangeable stories that have new villains and just sort of kind of just there's not really anything that sort of kind of keeps any sort of consistency going through. It's like watching a sitcom or something where start of the book something happens, and then by the end of the book it's resolved, and then like you could have missed it the next week or the next month, and it really wouldn't have mattered because nothing of any consequence really happened. So
yeah. And it also could be, I mean, as you go through these, I really liked the Long Shot series that Nocenti'd done, but she had Arthur Adams, and that was essentially something where they kind of almost co-wrote it, where having a collaborator you can depend on and who can write towards the strengths of may be something that has to do with it as well, because it is weird writing a script and not knowing who you're writing it for. And I know there are a number of writers out there who are much better when they know who they're writing for and they can target that towards a person rather than just writing kind of in the dark. But anyways, let's go take a look at some of these.
All right, so the year begins with Daredevil befriending a group of kids called the Fat Boys, who we'll see many more times throughout this year. It's just these kids, and they're doing stuff to help Daredevil or kind of keep tabs on people and everything. It's like his little messengers or something throughout the year.
Yeah. And they're like, what, 10, 12, something like that?
Yeah, they seem to be like preteen.
Yeah.
It's Butch, Darla, 8-Ball, and Ralph, RALF, are the group. They're from Hell's Kitchen, and then in this first episode, our issue, Daredevil then saves a girl from Sabretooth. Following that, we get a series of stories from Nocenti featuring a new villain. First, we had Rotgut, who is a Jack the Ripper style villain who doesn't really have any powers. He just likes to cut up people. So, yeah, that's great. Next, we had the Trickster, who is causing problems for New York City over Christmas. We then have an everyday man who accidentally kills his boss and becomes the Caviar Killer. And finally, we have a drug dealer who uses voodoo to control things that incurs the wrath of a real voodoo creature. So, again, pretty interchangeable, nothing that ends up lasting more than the issue that it's in, and you just sort of move on. And in fact, the next story that we get, which I think is the best story of the year, actually guest stars the Black Panther, and that is going to be our spotlight story for this week. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about that, but we'll just keep moving on. As the year then continues, we have more solo book stories that feel similar in scope and impact to the character as the ones before the spotlight book. We do see the return of Black Widow for an issue as the pair take down a deranged super soldier, and Karen tries to get Matt back into office work by surprising him with new offices, a new clinic, as it were, similarly to the free clinic thing that he was doing with Heather Glenn a few years ago. There was as part of that, a short-lived subplot where Karen Page starts to be frightened by the violence Daredevil dishes out, but she came to see it as fine after about an issue or two. So that was kind of the only thing that sort of permeated from one book to the next. She saw him like on TV beat somebody up and was really like frightened, and then like sees some of the scars on his knuckles and is like, I know how you got those, and that's kind of scary. But in the end, she ends up kind of really matter-of-factly sort of shrugging it off and being not that big a deal. So it wasn't obviously something that was supposed to have any sort of long-term reservations with her.
Yep.
And then the year ends with a 2-book story arc that involves another new villain, the Bushwhacker, who you mentioned as one of the new characters introduced this year, who has an arm that can be converted into a gun. And these books see the return of Wolverine to aid him in tracking down this villain, which ends up leading to a battle between the two over how justice should be handled. In this story arc, we also meet a young boy, Tyrone Jansen, who is blinded by chemicals dumped into the Hudson River. And that small subplot ends up actually being pretty important as we move into 1988. So that was something I definitely wanted to know. But that's it. That's really the year for Daredevil. Again, not bad. There's some interesting stuff going on, but nothing too exciting, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, these are, I don't know if you'd agree, but they're decent standalone stories, but this seems like it's going back into a time in comics that just does not really feel contemporary. Like, I know I was trying to read these in 87, and they just felt old school to me. Now, the one thing about them that is a redeeming characteristic, and it's the reason why Nocenti is going to be so good as she goes along, is almost all of them have a strong sort of social aspect to them. They deal with gangs, they deal with violence, they deal with people in low-income situations who are sort of trapped into the system. They really do take Daredevil back to the streets, and they make the streets a place that is sort of more, instead of, superheroes, it's just sort of that daily pain of people hurting each other sort of, in real life, that becomes the villain he faces. You get the voodoo stuff in that, but that's all wrapped up in all of this other sort of street level crime and stuff like that. The fact that she's starting to, look at society and social issues, I think is one of the reasons why it's going to be great later. One of the reasons a lot of it doesn't resonate now is that when you look at the books, they are drawn and colored about as brightly and as sort of just cotton candy-ish as you can imagine for the most part.
Yeah.
The voodoo book is a little bit different. That had some funky art in it, and it was cool and a little disorienting and the like, and I think sort of starts to give you an idea of how cool Nocenti's stories can be. But I think that really a lot of this does come down to the almost like the feel and the environment and the mood of the art. And the mood of the art is too clean and upbeat for the sort of grimy nature of the stories.
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
And when you
art doesn't match the story.
Yeah. And when you look at the art that's going to come in, that she's going to be working at with Loenardi Jr., he has just this naturally sort of scratchy, almost like kinetic sort of art that I think really matches up with the sort of disjointed storytelling that she has. So I would bet if Ramada Jr. had done all of these books, I would have liked them a lot more. even if nothing changed about the story, because they would have felt dirtier and grimier and more street level.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, I think I would agree with that, just based on what I was seeing post, 1988, 1989, with those two working together. So as far as what's new, the new place is Karen's Hotline and Legal Advice Clinic. So this is similar to that storefront that we were talking about with Heather Glenn. No Foggy Nelson involved in this. And Matt Murdock's not actually a lawyer. He's providing legal advice, but he's not actually like going and litigating on behalf of the people he's talking to that come see him here.
Yep.
He does seem to be into this a little bit. He was kind of apprehensive about it when she brings him to the new office, but he does seem to kind of take to it as I would expect that he probably would. The life of a short order cook or something just isn't the long term answer, I think, for Matt Murdock when it comes to what makes a fulfilling life.
Nope, that is almost certainly true.
As far as new supporting characters, we mentioned both of the ones that I want to call out: the Fat Boys, the kids from Hell's Kitchen that help out from time to time throughout this year, and then Tyrone Jansen, the little boy blinded by radioactive chemicals that were dumped into the Hudson River by a company called Kelco Chemicals. Again, this will be more important as we look at the stories in 1988. As far as new villains, we have Sabretooth. To this book, at least, is the X-Men villain from the Morlock Tunnels. We had Rotgut, Trickster, everyday man by the name of Joe, who becomes the Caviar Killer, thanks in part to kind of the media, making him into this Robin Hood sort of person. We had Danny Guitar and the Nameless One. Danny Guitar is the drug dealer, and the Nameless One being the voodoo creature he angers by using voodoo to sort of control his distribution network and that sort of thing. We had Chance. We had Agent Croc, who is the deranged super soldier in the sewers of New York that Black Widow and Daredevil take down. And then obviously Bushwhacker, the armed gunman villain who is out killing mutants that Wolverine and Daredevil are going after. So not a lot of villains there that I think are overly memorable outside of say Sabretooth and Bushwhacker who are in these books, but yeah, they served their purpose. They gave us stories to get us through 1987.
So I have a question for you.
Okay.
We had a bunch of artists, kind of like you noticed. You've got Sal Bucema, you've got Louise Williams, who did most of them, Todd McFarland, Keith Pollard, Chuck Patton, Tom Morgan, Keith Giffen, and Rick Leonardi. For those of you who've maybe read comics from the 80s, you know just how different a lot of these artists are. Those of you who maybe haven't read some of these artists, many of them, like Bucema, is a classic, sort of very clean line, 1970s standard Marvel sort of look type of penciler. Todd McFarlane, of course, is young, and he's Todd McFarlane with kind of that elongated, sketchy kind of art. Keith Pollard is a little bit more of a traditional artist as well. You got Keith Giffen, who had these crazy elongated, he wasn't quite in his everything's a 9-panel grid phase, but he also wasn't back in his Legion days. And then Rick Leonardi has kind of this sort of more fluid, elegant kind of style. Whose Daredevil did you like best this year? If you can remember or think to which art style, like did the art in any of these books really grab you?
I don't think that any of the art grabbed me the way, say, Frank Miller's has, or even oh god,
Gene Colan.
Gene Colan, the way Gene Colan's art did. I think Rick Loenardi is the one that I think I remember the best. It was obviously the end of the year, and so maybe it's just recency bias with regards to reading it. But if I had to choose one of these that I thought I liked the best, that would probably be the one that I would pick.
That would be my choice as well. I think the Loenardi issues are the strongest. I also like the Keith Giffen ones, although it's Giffen with almost another style. Like, he's very famous for the look he had during the Legion years in the early 80s, and then for his ambush bug and all of this sort of stuff, where he goes into almost like this 9-panel grid. This is sort of in between that. And some of the characters look very cartoony. Some of them look very, very sort of, proper and realistic. It's a very interesting book, but it doesn't seem like it fits necessarily perfectly for Daredevil, because his stuff is a little cartoony, and I don't know that Daredevil normally does well with cartoonish type style. So I was just wondering which one was.
Yeah. So I do remember, we're going to talk about our Spotlight book, issue 245, which was Chuck Patton. And that one definitely felt like more of an old school sort of look and feel to it. Definitely felt like something that I would have read, 100 issues ago, as opposed to in the, issue almost 250 into the Daredevil run.
And again, I think what's happening a lot here is Marvel's, in this, you've got a few people who've remained sort of with Marvel, like Loenardi. You've got a lot of guys who are sort of older hands that have been around a long time, and they just, Marvel's where they've always been. And so evidently, maybe even at that point, Sal Buscema's probably got 15 or 20 years on Jim Shooter, and Shooter just never bothered him. You don't know. But a lot of these folks are, kind of either very young names or names that we really don't know, that have been kind of workman-like players that aren't necessarily the ones who are going to get the big contract offers from somebody else to leave, and so they're still there. Still very talented guys in many cases, but
yeah.
This week's Spotlight Story. All right, Dwayne. So you've chosen Daredevil 245, August of 1987. The title of this one is Burn. Stars the Daredevil and co-stars Black Panther. Tell me a little bit about this one and why you decided you wanted to talk about it.
This was actually, when I was thinking back after reading all the books this year, I was like, what's the thing that sort of stands out to me, or what was the one that kind of made me think the most after I finished reading it? And it was this book. So I think it's definitely worth talking about. And the story opens with a man in a Wakandan jacket named Wheeler getting shown what happens if he doesn't pay the money he owes some bookies whom he once worked for. In breaking the legs of one of his clients, it catches the attention of Daredevil, who swoops in and quickly ends the demonstration. And while attending to the victim, Wheeler uses the opportunity to steal some money from one of the bookies and go try and gamble his way into a bigger fortune. Wheeler wins a bit, but then can't walk away from the table before losing it all. And when he returns home, where we see a vibranium suit and learn via a flashback that Wheeler was once a great hero in Wakanda and is married to one of T'Challa's cousins, Mary, before becoming disillusioned, and they move to New York City. Mary is upset by the situation with Wheeler, has locked herself in a room and won't interact with Wheeler or her son Billy, so the boy calls to his uncle T'Challa, who he sees in the newspaper will be coming to New York City. So that is the setup for this. really interesting stuff. Like I said, an old school look as part of this. Definitely, you talked about kind of that, so the kind of the social issues and kind of that day to day sort of thing. You have bookies and they're, breaking somebody's leg and threatening people and all this sort of thing. I was really kind of taken in by the story, at least, even if the art wasn't really resonating with me as much.
So yeah, I think one thing also, it's interesting that they did bring in a black guy as the penciler on this. So Chuck Patton is one of the relatively few black artists working at Marvel at this time. They do that a lot, that the African American pencilers and writers follow along with Black Panther and some of the other black characters. I think partly that's because increasingly the fans were starting to know the creators, and a lot of the black comic fans liked following these particular characters, and they liked following these particular creators. So
that makes sense.
It sort of was synergistic, but it did make some sense. It's also a little weird sometimes, though, that you keep seeing the same writers and pencilers sort of pop up with the same characters as they move through the Marvel universe. But there probably was a good reason for it, that did support some of the fans liking to see some of their favorite artists along with some of their favorite characters when they guest star on these things. But this was an interesting setup to the story. I'm intrigued by how they've just kind of got like this suit, a vibranium suit hanging out. Like, if you have a vibranium suit, that's basically like having, I don't know, an entire room full of gold or something. Why are you living in a small apartment with basically vibranium of any sort? It's basically a priceless metal. So he should just return that to T'Challa and ask him for a pile of cash and be done with it. But there you go.
Yeah, that did. In retrospect, that does seem like that is a reasonable way of handling the situation. But that's not how this went.
That's not what they did. So there you go.
So as we continue, when he arrives, T'Challa finds Wheeler gambling what little money he has in a card game. He pulls Wheeler away from the table, which infuriates Wheeler. But before more heated words could be thrown, some street thugs attempt to rob the pair. Wheeler and T'Challa make quick work of them. And then T'Challa informs Wheeler that he'll come by to see his cousin Mary tomorrow. And if she's unhappy, that he'll take her back to Wakanda when he leaves New York. So obviously something big needs to happen, and this is where this goes from here. He says, knowing he needs money, Wheeler puts on that vibranium armor and proceeds to rob a bank, which leads to a fight with Daredevil and then with the Black Panther. When Wheeler submits to the pair, we learn Mary wouldn't even see T'Challa and that Billy isn't going to school like he should be. T'Challa tells Wheeler he should leave town and his family for good. Daredevil disagrees, which leads to a fight between Daredevil and the Panther. Meanwhile, Wheeler contemplates suicide before a helicopter with cops flies in and opens fire on him. Wheeler's suit is hit, it starts smoking, and appears as though it's willing to explode. Daredevil, over the objections of Black Panther, rushes to Wheeler's aid and saves him. The story ends with Daredevil and Wheeler returning the money, Wheeler getting a real job, which allows him to go get food for his family and a tennis ball for his son Billy, and Mary forgiving Wheeler for everything that they've been going through. It is pretty, like, I don't want to say it kind of goes to 11 sort of thing, but at the same time, it's like, he knows he needs money to make Mary feel better, so I'm going to put on the vibranium suit and I'm going to rob a bank. And this is definitely the best idea that I could do to remedy this situation.
Yeah. Somebody with this many bad ideas probably should not be trusted with a vibranium suit, to be quite frank.
Probably not. Yeah, probably not.
What was the vetting process for this that he was able to get one of these in the first place. But it's a story that has some holes. It's fun and interesting in some ways, and I do like overall, like you said, the art is old school, but I think it fits the almost very moralistic kind of tone of this. This feels like a 1970s after school special type of vibe.
Definitely. Definitely.
It's got a very special episode or something like that. And so this is the other thing, is that the sort of storytelling that Nocenti's doing now, if it hits, great. If it doesn't, it can seem really sort of preachy and maudlin a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. To your point, there's two things I think that are kind of interesting in here, and it is, this story speaks to addiction quite heavily. He just has to gamble. He's like, because when he's confronted and submits to Daredevil and Black Panther, and they're talking to him afterwards, they're like, just get a job, man. Do the things that everybody else does, and you'll be fine. And Wheeler says, I can't stop. I can't go back. It's like having a fever that never breaks. You're burning up, you're sweating it out, but the fever never breaks. I hate myself. I jump out of my own skin if I could. And that, to me, very much feels like that after school special thing that you're talking about. And it definitely feels like, oh, here's the moral of the story kind of thing that you're supposed to take from this. The other thing that I thought was really interesting about kind of the aftermath of that discussion is the fact that Black Panther seemed very willing to let Wheeler just self-destruct. Like, he's not he was willing to like pay off his debts and everything like this, but it was still, he had to go get the job and do the things that he needed to do. If he had the kind of this clean slate again. And when he's kind of told, I can't do that. I'm stuck. I have this addiction. I need to gamble, and it's wrecking everything. And he basically just says, leave. You can self-destruct.
Yeah. And
it should only hurt you.
Yeah.
Versus hurting your family.
That does seem, Black Panther has a relatively strong moralistic streak in him. He is very Captain America-ish sometimes in his over moral kind of ways.
That might just be my unfamiliarity with the character.
I think especially in terms of, he's gotten himself in trouble sometimes, I think, especially in terms of like Wakandans and the like. He is definitely a bit more of a moralist, but it is odd in the context of the character and what we'd normally want to look at in terms of a hero that he would act that way. So yeah, probably it's partly because he's the guest star, and so he's a foil for what Daredevil's doing, and so there has to be some way to have some, if Black Panther was the star of the book and Daredevil was guest starring, then Daredevil would be the dick that's spouting the nonsense. That's just sort of the way it goes.
That does sort of make sense, yeah. The other thing that was interesting is, we're a year removed basically from Born Again, and we had just sort of a microcosm of Born Again kind of almost in one issue. And it wasn't obviously Daredevil, it was this Wheeler character where he basically ends up sort of reinventing himself by the end of the issue, and sort of is now kind of the model person that he was kind of supposed to be. He has somehow managed to kind of kick the gambling habit. He's now going and he's doing the job thing that he was told that he needed to do. He's earning money the way he needs to do, watching over his kid the way he needs to do, and then Mary now is willing to see him and interact with him again by the end of the book.
Yeah. Yep. It's very pat ending in a lot of ways. But it's a comic book. Theoretically, these are still made for like adolescents. There is something about the positive ending of this that I think is probably, kind of nice. It is, again though, it feels very pre-80s. Like this is a 1950s comic book structure, stuck smack dab in the middle of the year after Frank frickin' Miller just wrote Daredevil,
Yeah.
And it does seem strange. So, well, we'll see how it goes though. I will admit that reading through these this week was a slog for me. There were a number of times they're very dialogue heavy.
Yes.
They're very exposition heavy. There's a lot of things going on with a ton of different characters, and then also the fact that a lot of the stuff that's going on with him and Karen, I'm not really sure a lot of it necessarily made so much sense. Having 6 or so different artists drawing the same characters made it a little weird because she didn't necessarily look the same from issue to issue. So I'm like,
right.
Oh, this blonde woman, who is this? Oh, that's Karen. All right. Would not have known that unless they'd told me. And then we proceed from there, So, yeah.
I'm actually a little surprised because, like, I know when we were reading through Moon Knight, that was definitely something that sort of irked me is, when we would change artists, I would have a hard time sort of kind of reorienting myself to what I was reading because the characters didn't look the way I expected them to look when a new artist took over. And I think I'm starting to get used to it now, so it didn't bother me quite as much, but there was a lot of change this year when it came to artists. And so these characters that, we've seen for 230 some odd issues are suddenly, looking different from issue to issue, basically. And you just had to sort of deal with it.
Yeah. Yep. No, it can be a little crazy. I also am starting to wonder, like, if I'm this frustrated in the middle of the late 80s, what am I going to be like in 1996 and 1997, Dwayne? You're gonna
I don't know.
Keep me from jumping off my own deck to my death if I'm this bad now. So
please don't. First, secondly, I have no idea what's coming that far in advance, so it kind of frightens / worries me what we might be getting into by the late 90s.
Yeah,
I mean, I guess survive. I've seen a little bit of a preview with it, with regards to some of the things that were going on with Moon Knight in the early to mid to later-ish 90s, and it was something, if I remember right.
We'll survive it together, Dwayne. You and I and our beloved listeners will all survive it together somehow. So but yeah, this was an interesting year in comics, just overall, reading back through and seeing what was going on and the like. And I think partly it's just that sort of hangover from 1986 too. That so much cool stuff came out, and everybody burned themselves out, and then you kind of had a year of going, okay, so how hard do I want to work to try and top Watchmen and whatever, or do I just give up and take a year off and hope people forget, and then we'll try again in 1988.
This week's takeaway. All right, Dan, it was a year for comics in 1987, coming off the high of 1986. What is the takeaway for this year? Is it? Yeah, I don't even know how to broach the subject or of like trying to lead you into where this might be going. So tell us, what is the takeaway?
To me, I've got it written simply as this is when bills come due, or you start to see what happens when bills come due. that not only in a literal sense, where you've got comic book shops and distributors and publishers that just can't pay their bills because of the fact they've overextended, expecting a quick speculator boom in 1985 and 1986 to turn into a continued sort of, juggernaut of additional readership. But also in terms of bills came due for Jim Shooter and all of the times where he'd made decisions which alienated people over the last decade. And bills came due for Marvel in terms of the fact that DC decided to pull the bandage off and reboot their universe. And now they've got dozens of vibrant new number ones wandering out where they are able to reboot their characters and tell new stories. And Marvel is kind of going, we're kind of, looking a little old here with our books with their numberings of 250 or whatever. And, DC's got all of his shiny new number ones, right? I think that you start to see the fact that Archie Comics starting to lose its major titles, and a lot of the kids' comics not being able to make it when Marvel puts them out, shows that there's bills coming due in terms of the fact that the industry as a whole just has not taken care of the next generation for the better part of a decade. And now when they decide to start taking a look at that generation isn't there. And first the kids' comics die, then the preteen books like Archie die, and then suddenly you start seeing things hitting higher up the chain. So there's just all sorts of things that have been sort of chugging along in the comics world that look like enhancements and innovations. The direct market itself that starts to really bite us at this point. The problem is, what happens if you make a product, hit a speculator boom in that product that ends up wrecking half of your retail stores, but you've now put so much of your industry's sort of future into those specialized stores that if they go under, you've got no place to sell anymore, right? It's not like the supermarkets were going to go out of business. People are always going to need food, right? But so there's just a lot of things this year where 1987 started a reckoning, and it's a point where DC was probably the one company that, as a lot of this is going on, is sitting there going, yep, we saw stuff coming. We realized we had to make changes. We made a painful change, and now we're reaping some of the benefits from that. Whereas Marvel's going to have to start rebuilding, and they've got the tools. They got all these young guys there. We're going to see some cool stuff happening. But this was a tough year for them, and a tough year overall for comics.
Almost surprising because it feels like this should have happened before now, but it now sort of is. It is happening, and it's like almost a surprise that it is happening because it's like if it was going to happen, it should have happened by now, but it didn't happen by now, so it probably wasn't going to happen, and then it happened. So I don't know. It just seems sort of weird to me, but I guess it makes total sense given like all the decisions and big and small decisions that have been made add up, and eventually something's going to happen as a result of it, and we're now finally seeing that sort of happen.
Yep, and changes in technology and changes in processes, changes in everything. The sort of supply chain disaster that we had in 1987 would not have been possible without the small press world, which was fed by better paper and easier printing and cheaper printing methods for small publishers and the like. And it was fed by Marvel and DC continuing to pump out 70 books a year to flood the market, even while all these other guys are flooding the market. And so lots of decisions, lots of things going on in the economy and the world, and they all just sort of combined to take out a bunch of stores and a bunch of publishers and some distributors this year. So
very interested in seeing over the next year or two what ends up happening as a result of this, because it feels like there's no way that there isn't going to be some pretty major ramifications with everything that has sort of kind of come to a head here as we look at 1987.
I'm going to be interested to review this more because I know that it seems like we've just reached kind of this end of a thing, but we haven't, because the speculator market is going to continue onward for a while now, and it's not going to crash really for another 5 or so years. So 88 to like 92, 93 is an area I'm going to be really interested to see what's going on in terms of the dynamics of that. I've started reading some of it, but I kind of am still putting together my thoughts on it. And very interesting times in comics coming up. Some of the most interesting years in terms of trying to figure out what's going on of the last 50 years are going to be coming up the next few weeks here.
That sounds very interesting, and we've got a bunch to look forward to then. That's going to put a wrap on this week's show. We'd like to thank you for joining us. If you're new to the podcast, please consider subscribing on your podcast player of choice. That way you'll get each new episode as soon as it's released. If you've already subscribed, we'd appreciate it if you'd share the show via social media or leave us a review. That will help new listeners find the show much easier. Whether you're new to the podcast or you've been with us from the beginning, we'd love to get your thoughts about this week's show. You can send those to us via email at comments@comicsovertime.com or via Twitter or Blue Sky. We're at Comics Over Time there. Until next week, take care, everybody.